This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. It is America's longest war, a quagmire in the mountains, a scene of barbarism and brutality, a war that is little understood by Americans and underreported by the news media, a forgotten war that occupies more than 100,000 U.S. troops, 40,000 NATO troops, costs $2 billion a week, and at least to this observer seems doomed to failure. Here to talk about Afghanistan and reporting on the war is Ray Rivera of the New York Times. He is recently back from a year-long stint as Times Afghanistan correspondent. Before Afghanistan, he reported from the Metro Bureau of the New York Times, where I met him. Ray was a staff writer before that at the Washington Post and has also worked for the Seattle Times, the Salt Lake Tribune, and the Santa Fe New Mexican. Welcome, Ray. Good
Thanks.
to see you.
Good to see you.
Haven't seen you in more than a year. It's often said that reporters write the first draft of history. What does your first draft look like?
Well, I think upon arriving, one of the first things you recognize in getting there is that the efforts to stabilize this country and leave it as a self-functioning, self-governing country are not much closer today than they were 10 years ago. And I think that's fairly obvious. The U.S. has put tremendous resources into the effort in the last 2 years under Obama's surge. But what success that's going to have is a big question mark, especially with an exit, with a specific timeline to get out. So one wonders, and I think we're seeing a lot of signs on the ground, that the Taliban are sort of playing a waiting game at this point, knowing that, you know, in the history of Afghanistan, 3 years of waiting time is not that big a haul.
And many invaders have suffered the consequences of long duration occupations and then, you know, humiliating withdrawals. The latest before us, the Soviets.
That's right. And what has been most troublesome for the U.S., I think probably more than anything, militarily they are, you know, far superior to the Taliban. The Taliban cannot compete with the U.S. militarily. But after such a long period, many of the people there, even the people who very much supported the U.S. coming in and pushing the Taliban out, are weary of the U.S. presence now. This is a country that doesn't, as you mentioned, doesn't have a great history of welcoming occupiers. And after a period of, you know, after 10 years, they have grown quite tired of the U.S. presence.
And you and your reporting, as we talked about off camera when I archived Ray Rivera and Afghan in the Times archives, there were 271 stories, both print stories, internet stories, and blog stories. But one of the themes is that, in a sense, we're creating enemies and losing friends in over time here.
That's right, and one wonders what would have happened, and I think you know, a lot of people have said this, when the U.S. first intervened in that country, they were met with, you know, open arms and, you know, welcome signs by I think a large segment of the population. And had they pushed the resources in then, and not at one point in 2003 diverted many of the resources to Iraq, one really wonders what might have happened in that country if the U.S.'s occupation would have gone a different course than the British occupation, the Russian occupation, and countless occupations through time. This country is known as...
So we made a fundamental strategic error in diverting, and in a sense the Obama critique of, I guess, the Bush strategy seems to have unfolded.
Well, I think, you know, President Obama, when he came in, he tried to essentially reverse that. That part of that reverse process was already in place. started under President Bush, but did it come too late? And that question is still to be answered. Evidence is that it probably did come too late. The U.S. has, like the Russians before, the political and economic fundamentals at home are not such that they could really support this war much longer than beyond 2014, which is their planned exit stage right now.
Let's talk a little bit about the state of Afghan reporting. I guess the best piece that I was able to find is from the Neiman Watchdog from the Neiman Foundation up at Harvard. And the conclusions are that there's a general decline in international coverage, fewer reporters are developing expertise, and there's a reliance on sort of a small pool of reporters that are on the ground, that news bureaus are withdrawing for a number of reasons. There's not much TV, it's the print folks on the ground. Talk about the state of reporting.
Well, it's exactly as you said, and this is not a phenomenon unique to Afghanistan or Iraq or international reporting. This is a fundamental downsizing of the industry. We have fewer national bureaus, fewer international bureaus, fewer reporters reporting domestically, fewer newspapers.
Right.
The New York Times and the Washington Post have suffered all these same travails, but they have continued to commit to the story. With the New York Times, we have typically 3 to 4 reporters assigned to Afghanistan full-time. In Iraq
which
now,
is a big bureau. I mean,
which is a big bureau.
If you look at everybody else's, they're not there.
Really the largest of any print organization there, I believe. There could be some international presence I'm unaware of, but I don't think so. But of course, even saying that, 3 or 4 reporters assigned to Afghanistan means that because we rotate in and out, there may be 1, 2, if we're lucky, 3 reporters in the country at any given time.
Talk about this rotation a bit. I mean, how long were you in consecutively? You were there for a year, the posting, but you weren't in Afghanistan for a year.
Right. We do have a reporter who lives there full time and has been there for 9 years, Carlotta Gall. She's now doing a fellowship at Harvard. And the rest of us, more or less, we have other reporters who've been assigned there 2, 3 years, quite a long time for coverage there. But typically what we do is we go in, we report, we stay there for 6 weeks. We have a house in Kabul that we live in, and we have a staff there, a local staff that helps us, including translators, drivers, everything else we need, fixers, as we call them. And we'll work for 6 weeks, and then we'll come home for a break, 3-week break, and we go back.
Because otherwise it'd be horrible on families. I mean, you've got a family, you've got children.
Right, I've got 3 young children, and one of them was born while I was there. I did come home for the birth, but
oh my God.
so yeah, it would be very difficult to do. Of course, we can't complain compared to what soldiers endure there, which are much longer durations without seeing family. But so we are in typically 6 weeks. We work 7 days a week, and then we come home. And during those 3 weeks, usually we're supposed to have it off entirely, and we usually do.
In this 2 commentaries in.
Can I just make one other point though?
Sure.
On the number of stories you cited 271, which I'm surprised there were that many, but. Part of that, too, is the changing nature of reporting for a place like the New York Times, wherein, because we're now a 24-hour news operation, in the olden days, a correspondent might go into a country like Afghanistan and roam around and write 1 or 2 or 3 very big stories. Sure. But now we have to both cover the daily stories that we think are significant, and as well as the big enterprise and investigative pieces. So. And this is true not only in Afghanistan, but in every aspect of the newsroom. So there are a lot more demands on today's reporter in that regard, that we are now feeding a digital operation that runs 24 hours. And trying to feed that machine with in-depth stories not just quick breaking news, but breaking news with depth and analysis, but at a much faster rate, and then coming back with a much more nuanced and developed piece for the daily print edition. So the demands are quite a bit higher, even as the staff numbers have dropped, and this is not just at the New York Times, but virtually every newspaper. So, I mean,
what I'm sensing here is that there are really gaps in coverage, and the gaps in coverage, small number of reporters, short visits, sort of a Kabul-centered approach, in sort of the capital, and also being at the mercy, if you will, of the military in terms of some reporters being embedded and not really being independent. Now, in these two pieces, the Times was generally excluded from the critique because Hanneman, the author, argued that given your resources, that you are more independent and able to go out and do the type of mix of stories that you were able to do. But that's a phenomenon of decreasing frequency.
Yeah, well, I'm not entirely sure that the stories, I guess I would have to go back and look at the wide range of reporting that goes on. I wouldn't necessarily say the stories coming out of there by the news organizations that are there are necessarily Kabul-centric, but you're right, we are limited in a number of ways that getting out into the country is quite difficult. It has to be planned very carefully. There are many places we can't go to without the military, which then requires us to...
Because it's dangerous.
Because it's too dangerous. And the number one threats for reporters there right now are kidnappings and roadside bombs, both of which, traveling between there may be two cities, Kabul and a city over here, say Gardez in a neighboring province. Both cities are fairly safe to stay in. Kabul is a very safe city to drive around and spend time in. But that road in between there is, there are numerous kidnappings on that road. There are, occasional roadside bombs. So it's a very difficult task. What we have to do is plan out in advance. We get over there early in the morning. We come back that same day, unless we have a very secure place to stay. We can't really telegraph to people there what our plans are, for fear that they'll communicate with the Taliban and will be picked up along the way. There's a lot of caution that has to go into getting out and
it's clearly dangerous. More than 24 journalists have been killed. You've got kidnappings. The Times' David Rhodey was kidnapped and had to escape from his captors. So we're talking about real dangers. In addition to the real dangers, did you sense that there was an effort by the authorities to limit your access?
Well, the national authorities or the
national or U.S.
Yeah, or NATO. I don't think so. It is kind of going that way to some degree as American consultants, U.S. consultants largely, and NATO consultants, get embedded into government agencies there, in essence, to help them with their PR strategies, to help them deal with the media. And that's had, kind of an unfortunate effect if you're a reporter, because you want to be able to just walk into, before we had fairly easy access to government agencies and ministers. We could walk in, talk to them, and they were pretty candid. People in Afghanistan generally are pretty candid. You can't always tell who's telling the truth, but they're pretty candid, and if they have the information, you can generally get it from them with some delay, maybe. But as these consultants work with them, they're learning to act a little more like American companies and American government agencies.
Not a good thing.
Be a little more guarded. So it's making life a little more difficult for reporters.
How do you operate with the other reporters? I mean, you are in a team. You've got Americans, but also you have a lot of Afghanis. Do the people in the bureau, for example, does anybody speak native languages, or do you rely on Afghans? I mean, what is the relation? What does it look like? What does it feel like, the actual reporting?
Well, you're right, we have some local reporters and translators, and then we have Times correspondents from the U.S., and we have to work very closely together, both in charting out what stories we're going to do, deciding what interviews need to be done, and typically, you know, we don't speak Pashto or Dari, or very, very limited amounts of Pashto and Dari. And frankly, for the sophistication of the reporting we're doing, we have to, it's really much better to rely on a very good translator. So finding very good translators is a challenge who can really translate sophisticated information from Dari or Pashto into English. And in our newsroom, we have some native Pashto speakers, we have some native Dari speakers, and one is a doctor by training, not a journalist. You know, very seldom do you get trained journalists, but they're very smart people and very familiar with the customs cultures. So
and they're dangerous for them as well.
very dangerous for them. They, you know, if people, and we have also stringers around the country, Afghan stringers who, when something happens in some part of the country, who keep an eye on what's happening elsewhere. And that's where we get a lot of our information. So you'll see.
Do you have any reliability problems with that?
We do. We haven't had an issue with reliability. I don't believe. But it's something we have to pay attention to. The reliability issue is often less with the reporter, because these are people we've worked with for a long time. We've cultivated. We've
And they,
to
in
some
a sense,
degree
become
trained.
professionalized.
They, you know, they have. The reliability is often with the people they're talking to. You know, the government official. There's so many feuds and clan rivalries and everything going on that if you hear about an explosion in this part of the country, it might be the Taliban who planted that bomb. It might be one faction fighting another faction. They might be both pro-government factions fighting against each other for
You don't know the
power
players
in that.
without a scorecard.
It's very difficult.
Is there a scorecard, in fact?
You know, it's one that has to be constantly updated. So it's very, very difficult to know. But that's where, to some degree, we rely on the local knowledge of our reporters. And they are remarkable at understanding this, understanding who the players are. And, you know, we, after a time there, can begin to understand who the players are and everything as well. But what we understand right away is to treat everything with some skepticism, which, of course, is a tenet of journalism to begin with. But so we do have to approach anything we're hearing with, again, with caution and, you know, dig a little deeper.
Let's move sort of to Ray Rivera going to Afghanistan. How are the assignments made? I mean, how were you made the offer that you couldn't or didn't refuse to go to Afghanistan, having been in the Metro Bureau of the Times?
No, I volunteered.
You did?
Yeah.
And you were offered that opportunity?
I think it would be difficult for any news organization to say you're going to Afghanistan, especially if you have.
Would you like to go to Afghanistan?
If you have young kids at home. I had wanted to do this kind of coverage going back to my days at the Seattle Times, and something always blocked it. I was having a child. I was, you know, something was always coming up, and this time I'd volunteered to. You know, the opportunity came open, and I volunteered to go.
Now, how did the opportunity come open? I mean, how did it work?
Well, it's open fairly often. I mean, it's difficult. It's not as easy as you would think to find reporters who are willing to give up a year of their time to go to Afghanistan or Iraq.
Okay.
I mean, it's, you know, early on that was not the case. You know, this was an exciting story. Everybody was following it closely. But these are stories now that are largely out of the public eye, that aren't on the front page every day like they used to be.
Right.
Right now we're seeing a lot more interest in Iraq because of the troop pullout and what's happening there with the civil unrest as a result of that. And we're going to see Afghanistan becoming increasingly a more important story over the next 3 years as American troops begin to pull out and as these latest efforts at peace talks start to unfold.
How did you prepare for the assignment? I mean, you volunteer, they say yes. What do? You pack your bags and leave? I mean, what's the nature of the prep?
Well, like any assignment, you know, this is what we do. We do a lot of reading. We do what we can to catch up on the current situation. We do go through a survival training course. It's a 1-week course, either typically in Virginia, that a private security company puts on, that teaches you teaches you various aspects of first aid and things to do and not to do if you're kidnapped or stopped on the side of the road and that kind of thing. We get our body armor and we're off.
And you arrive in Afghanistan. What's your first story?
My first story in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't recall, but
okay.
I'm sure it was I'm sure it was something, probably a breaking news story, probably a roadside bomb that perhaps killed some civilians or
Remember the
something like
last
that.
story you did as you left?
I do. The last story I did was on death squads, Taliban death squads that were killing people who were in any way lending any sort of assistance to the coalition or pro-government forces. And I think one of the most frightening aspects of this is that these were people getting killed with no record of them being killed. Neither the United Nations, who tracks civilian casualties, nor NATO, who tracks civilian casualties, had any records of these deaths that we were able to find. And we were just in this one little province along the Pakistan border, and we were able to find quite a lot of deaths that had happened over a few-month period. So it makes you wonder how many of these are really going on, across the.
You've got a November 29, 2011 story titled "Militants Turn to Death Squads in Afghanistan," and it talks about bodies being spaced out evenly in a road and their heads formed in a semicircle with their faces clearly visible. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is terrorism raised to its highest form, no?
Absolutely. It's this is exactly the message they intend to send, and it's a very effective. The proof of its effectiveness is that nobody told. Nobody called the local authorities. Nobody took them to the local hospitals. Nobody, this was a killing that remained silent. Even when we went to go and try and talk to people, it was very difficult to get them to acknowledge that anything had happened. We had an execution that took place. We had a video of an execution that took place in a marketplace, in a bazaar, and the local governor of that bazaar, of that area, of that little district, swore up and down that nothing had happened there. But we had a video showing that it happened.
This is like Groucho Marx saying to Margaret Dumont, "Who do you believe, me or your lying eyes?"
Right.
Really.
And it was, and reporting that story was so difficult because this bazaar was in a fairly isolated place. He may very well have not known that it had happened, but it was unlikely because he was in close contact with the U.S. military, who had a copy of the video. So it was likely that he knew, and he wasn't telling us. But we had to, in order for us to verify this story, find out details of it. The U.S. had a copy of this video that they'd taken off a captured insurgent, but they knew no details of it. They had an idea of where it occurred, but the date they thought it had happened it turned out the wrong date. We had to actually send, in fact, we advised a person not to go, a local person. They ended up going anyway, and reported that story out, and it was with remarkable courage that they did that. So we were able to get the details of that killing.
Lots of troubling stories. I mean, is that the most troubling story that you had to report?
Well, troubling in terms of perhaps long-term trends there, but I think there were a lot. I mean, just in terms of the stories I worked on, I did a story some months back on, I think one of the first fairly big stories I did there was on the ease of infiltrating the Afghan military.
Mm-hmm.
And we had we interviewed a guy who had been responsible or played a part in 2 bombings, and he had, gone in and out of the insurgency, and he was still able to join the Afghan military, following all the proper procedures, going through all the normal checks. But one of the key aspects of that is contacting the local village elder, who is supposed to vouch for this person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we contacted the local village elder, who said, "What, vouch? No, I just said I know who he is. They didn't ask me to vouch for him." So, so there were some real basic misunderstandings of that. Another story I spent some time on was on recruiting patterns throughout Afghanistan. What we found, what was known but not to the depth of the problem, was that the NATO, and the Afghan government, despite spending so many resources pacifying the South, which was really the heartland of the Taliban, were having very, very little success in getting people there, young men there, to join the Afghan military, or mainly the military, the army. And it reflected, to me, it seemed like a real strong reflection of the sympathy they still had for the Taliban, and to probably a slightly less degree, the wariness they had of the Afghan government and its ability to maintain itself, or to survive. And what was interesting, it showed, I think all of those stories showed long-term problems that continue to exist in that country.
Last question. I mean, have you had enough of international hotspot reporting?
No, I don't think you ever have enough of.
Ooh, where do you go next?
International reporting. Well, I'm happy to stay here for a while. I don't think I could do another long stretch away from my children at the ages they're at now, and my wife. That would be too much. It took it was a big haul for our family, and so we're happy to be home for a while. But
you could be
shorter duration reporting, or shorter duration stints would be always welcome.
Ooh. My thanks to Ray Rivera for being on the show. Join me next week when my guest will be Richard Collenberg, Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation. We'll talk about all things education here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.